The third edition of the 2021 playoff rankings will be released tonight at 7 o'clock. The show comes on ESPN 7 p.m., which, by the way, I'll be starting tonight's Uncle Lou After Dark College Football Call-In show at 7 p.m. instead of 10 p.m. every Tuesday when they release these rankings. That's when I start the show instead of waiting until 10. So tune in tonight at 7 o'clock. We'll watch the rankings show together, react to it, and then I'll take phone calls for an hour or so, and we can talk about it or this week's matchups or whatever you want to do. But up today, right now, the real rankings, the Uncle Lou Top 10. Let's go. Yeah, good morning in that, though, but it's Uncle Lou here, though. Yeah, that's right. It's me, Uncle Lou. And guess what? I'm live for you on LouTube today. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it also, and tune in addition to that as well. Hey, subscribe to this channel if you're not already. Did you know I post college football videos almost every single day of the year? It's true. In fact, some of them are even watchable. I don't know about this one. You can let me know in the comments down below at the end. Be sure and let me know which rankings you disagree with, too, and where you think these teams should be ranked. All right, now remember, my rankings are not a prediction of where teams will finish. My rankings are where I think teams deserve and or have earned the right to be so far this season. I consider, of course, a team's record, strength of schedule, if they lost, how bad did they lose, who did they lose to, was it a road game or a home game, what are a team's best wins. I consider all those kinds of things, and it's sort of a combination of where I think a team deserves to be ranked versus what I think they've earned. But again, this is not a prediction for what I think the final top 4 or top 10 will be. In fact, on Sunday on the Your Season Is Over video, I told you what I think the final 4 playoff teams will be. And at the end of this video, I'll tell you again. All right, only one team in my top 10 lost last week, and of course that was Oklahoma. I think that was the only team in anybody's top 10 that lost, the AP to coaches, whatever. I think that was the only top 10 team to go down last week, no matter what particular poll it was you were looking at. I had Oklahoma at number 2. Now, I never expected Oklahoma to finish number 2, but based on what had happened up to that point in the season, that's where I had them ranked last week. Obviously, they won't be ranked there this week. I'm going to start at number 10 and work my way up to number 1. I'll do my best to try to explain to you why I have certain teams ranked where I do or why I don't have another team ranked there instead. I don't expect you to agree with my reasoning, but the biggest complaint you hear about rankings all the time, other than the fact that they're just wrong, is that there's no explanation provided for why a team is ranked where they are. So I'll try to do as good a job as I can of telling you why I have teams ranked where I do. And if you're wondering when I do these ranking videos, why I'm looking up here when I do that, you know I have all these mini helmets. Well, I have another shelf that's right here that's the top 10 helmet. And I put the helmets up from 10 through 1 on this shelf. So rather than writing them down, I just look up at the shelf and say, okay, that's who I had at number 10. This week at number 10, Oklahoma. I dropped Oklahoma all the way back to number 10. I think that's a fair ranking for Oklahoma. I still think they're an okay team. I know they've struggled in a lot of games this year that they shouldn't have struggled in. They're playing a young quarterback. They've been switching quarterbacks in and out. The defense hasn't been what we thought it would be. And to be honest with you, I won't be surprised if Oklahoma loses another game before the end of the regular season. Oklahoma was sort of like Wake Forest. I don't mean that the teams are comparable. Clearly, I think Oklahoma is probably better than Wake Forest. What I mean is, if you looked at Oklahoma and Wake Forest's schedule, it became pretty clear about halfway through the season, in the case of both of those teams, that their most difficult games were in the last month of the season. And I questioned at 6-0, 7-0, 8-0, whether Oklahoma or Wake Forest, either one, could get through the month of November without a loss. Well, it turns out neither one of them could. Wake Forest, of course, has already taken a loss. Oklahoma took a loss this last week on the road at Baylor. And their 2 remaining games really aren't any easier. This week they play at home against Iowa State, and then they finish things up Thanksgiving weekend in the Bedlam game on the road against a red-hot Oklahoma State team who we'll talk more about in a minute. So I'm not convinced Oklahoma's going to finish the regular season 11-1. I mean, it's very possible, maybe even likely, that Oklahoma loses at least one more game in the regular season. If they play like they played this last week against Baylor or like they played against Kansas a couple of weeks ago, clearly they're going to lose at least one more game. I think the big question now with the Big 12 is, can anybody get into the playoff? If Oklahoma runs the table and finishes 12-1 with a Big 12 title, will that be good enough for us a 4 seed? If Oklahoma State runs the table and finishes 12-1 with a Big 12 title, would that be good enough for a 4 seed? We'll find those things out over the course of the next month. But I think that's the biggest question right now about the Big 12 outside of Oklahoma itself is, can anyone in the Big 12 right now get far enough up to crack into the playoffs? But like I mentioned, Oklahoma did lose to Baylor this week on the road, 27-14. They play this coming week back at home against Iowa State. We'll see what they do with the quarterback situation. They started Caleb Williams again last week, put Spencer Rattler in for a while, took him out, put Caleb Williams back in. I'm assuming they're going to go back to Caleb Williams and let him play against Iowa State, but Lincoln Riley has shown he's not afraid to play 2 quarterbacks, so we'll see what happens. I've got the Oklahoma Sooners at number 10. Coming in at number 9 this week, Notre Dame. Notre Dame did what they were supposed to do this past week, in my opinion. I don't understand why they were only favored by 6 on the road at Virginia. I don't think Virginia's a very good team. They're not terrible, but they really have no business competing with Notre Dame, and they didn't. Notre Dame won the game on the road 28-3. I think that's a good win. I think if you're a top 10 team and you play somebody like Virginia, you need to beat them by 3 or 4 touchdowns at a minimum. That's what Notre Dame went out and did. I do not think Notre Dame is getting into playoffs. I've heard some talk of that lately. Well, if this team lose and that team lose and this team lose and this team beats that team. A one-loss Notre Dame is not getting into playoffs, in my opinion, under any circumstances ever, barring total chaos and catastrophe at the end of the season. Notre Dame makes a conscious choice not to join a conference, therefore only playing 12 games. Not only that, and this is what you see a lot of times when you hear people talk about Notre Dame not being a conference, they say, well, it's not fair because they don't have to play a 13th game, so they go 12-0, but they avoid a possibility of a loss while other good teams are playing in a conference championship game. And while there's obviously some truth to that, this is a situation this year where being in a conference and having a 13th game could actually help Notre Dame, right? Notre Dame has a loss. It's a pretty good loss. Now, it's a home loss, so maybe you shake your head at that, and they lost by a couple of scores, but their loss is to Cincinnati. And regardless of what we individually might think about Cincinnati, the reality is they're in everyone's top 4 or 5 right now, or 6, depending on which poll you look at. They're a pretty good team. They didn't lose any games last year outside of the New Year's 6 game to Georgia. They haven't lost any games this year. They've got 2 Power 5 wins, including a 2-touchdown win on the road at Notre Dame. So that's not a terrible loss, but it's a loss. Now, if Notre Dame was in a conference and had an opportunity in a 13th game to play a top 15 or top 20, top 10 opponent in a conference championship game and win that game, I think Notre Dame would have a shot of vaulting into the top 4, depending on who that opponent was and how bad they beat them or if they beat them and things like that. So there are some years where not playing a 13th game has potentially helped Notre Dame, particularly the 2 years that they got into the playoffs. I think this is a year where not having a 13th game could hurt Notre Dame. So we'll see. But anyway, Notre Dame did what they needed to do. They won on the road at Virginia, which is good for Cincinnati, right? To me, that's the most important thing about Notre Dame over the next couple of weeks. If Notre Dame loses a game, it just takes all the shine off that Cincinnati win at Notre Dame. So outside of Notre Dame fans, Cincinnati fans are the biggest Notre Dame fans you'll find right now. I've got Notre Dame coming in at number 9. They play this week at home against a struggling Georgia Tech team. Number 8, I've got Oklahoma State. I'm guilty of this too, so I'm not getting on to anybody. We need to start paying attention to Oklahoma State. What's the narrative been about Oklahoma all season long? Yeah, they're winning, but they're barely winning. You know, they're barely beating Kansas. They're barely beating Texas. They're barely beating this team and that team. They just don't look good. They should be blowing these teams out. Check the scores of the last 3 Oklahoma State games. Oklahoma State is beating people by 20, 30, and 40 points a game over the last month. Oklahoma State is one of the hottest teams right now. Now, they've already got a loss, and that's what's kept them in the bottom half of the top 10 and even out of the top 10 up until a couple of weeks ago. This past weekend, they played at home against TCU and won 63-17. Now, you're going to say, well, that's TCU. I get it, but they won 63-17, right? We can't get on to Oklahoma and say the reason we're not ranking you higher is because you've struggled with all these bad teams. We can't say that to Oklahoma, but then turn around to Oklahoma State and go, Yeah, you're blowing these teams out, but it doesn't matter. They're bad teams. Of course it matters. This is what you have to do, especially if you have a loss. When you play bad teams, you have to not only beat them, you've got to destroy them. And that's what Oklahoma State is doing. Now, this week they play, who do they play this week? On the road at Texas Tech. That should be another 20, 30, or 40-point win by Oklahoma State. And then, of course, Thanksgiving weekend is the Bedlam game, Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State. If Oklahoma State wins that game, they're in the Big 12 title game. They could possibly get in even if they lose that game. Well, it's some weird tie-break scenarios right now within the Big 12. But if Oklahoma wins out and then wins the Big 12 title game, and they're sitting there at 12-1, it's very possible they wind up at the 4 seed, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the video when I tell you who I think will be the final 4 teams in the last playoff poll. Coming in at number 7 this week, I've got Michigan. They won again this past week. A pretty good win, I think, on the road at Penn State. They won 21-17. Penn State was ranked, I think, 23rd last week, in the 20s, depending on which poll you look at. I know there's a lot of different polls out now. This is a good win for Michigan and Jim Harbaugh, especially considering Michigan and Jim Harbaugh's track record, right? They have a hard time winning difficult road games. I know Penn State's got several losses this year, and they're not a top 10 team or anything like that, but this is the kind of game that Michigan has been losing year in and year out under Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, right? And they go on the road, and they get a 21-17 win in a place that's not that easy to play, Happy Valley, Penn State. Does this get the monkey off of Harbaugh's back? No, he's got to beat Ohio State. I mean, that's the end-all, be-all for Jim Harbaugh at Michigan right now. He's going to have to find a way to beat Ohio State at some point. Maybe, they play in 2 weeks. We'll see. But Michigan still has just a 1 loss to Michigan State. And I don't know how many of you watched that game. And look, at the end of the day, Michigan lost, and that's all that matters. Michigan was up 16 in the second half of that game. Michigan appeared to be the better team for the majority of that game. And in my opinion, some coaching blunders and some questionable play calling and offensive philosophy in the second half kind of lost that game for Michigan. If they played again, I don't think anybody would be surprised if Michigan won the game. But like I say all the time, they don't play again. It's just like the Oregon-Ohio State argument. People say, well, if Oregon and Ohio State played today, Ohio State would win. Well, they don't play today. They played 2 months ago, and it is what it is. I mean, you can't erase a loss. So they do have the loss. They're sitting there at 9-1. This week they play on the road at Maryland, a team they should beat. They got to avoid the distraction, right, of having Ohio State next week. They can't look past Maryland. They've got to go in there and handle business. Now, I don't think in terms of rankings, at this point in the season, given what Michigan has done so far and what they have left with Ohio State, I don't particularly think it matters whether Michigan beats Maryland by 1 point or 100. It's going to come down to the Michigan-Ohio State game in 2 weeks. But I've got them coming in this week at, what is that, 10, 9, 8, at number 7. They're 9-1. Like I mentioned, beat Penn State on the road this past week. They play at Maryland this week. Got to get through that, and then we'll see what happens in the Ohio State game. Coming in at number 6, I've got Michigan State. My reasoning is easy. Michigan State beat Michigan, and they have the same record. Maybe you say, well, Michigan's got a better loss. Yes, but the loss was to Michigan State, and that just has to matter. When you've got 2 Power 5 teams with the exact same record, in this case, 1 loss, just like with Oregon and Ohio State, I just don't see how you can place the losing team ahead of the winning team. I just don't see it. If results on the field don't matter, then what are we doing? I'm all for judging one team's loss against another, or this team's best win against another team's best win. But that's when you're trying to figure out who's better between 2 teams who either haven't played, two teams that haven't played. It's just insane to me, the idea that the playoff committee last week had, I think it was Michigan ahead of Michigan State. That's just insane. And playoff polls got Oregon ahead of Ohio State, and their reasoning is, well, they played and Oregon won. And then you ask them about Michigan and Michigan State, and they've got a whole other set of criteria that they look at. The playoff committee's become a complete joke at this point. I honestly don't know how much longer the playoff committee can last, at least not in the current format. No one respects it. No, I mean nobody. I'm a Georgia fan. We're ranked number 1. I don't have a personal gripe against where my team is ranked. So I'm just coming at this as almost like a neutral observer at this point. The playoff committee has become a total joke. I don't know what the answer or the solution is. College football is a subjective sport, at least in terms of ranking teams. I don't think there's any way you can take the subjectivity out of it completely. I mean, yes, you can expand the playoffs and include every conference winner in the playoffs, but every playoff scenario you ever hear includes, even if it includes that, it also includes, 2 at-large teams, 4 at-large teams. Well, where do you think those at-large teams are going to come from? Who do you think's going to be picking those at-large teams? It's going to be some version of a playoff committee, so we're never going to get rid of it. I love complaining about it just as much as the next guy, but the reality is the credibility of the playoff committee is at an all-time low this season, and the primary reasons, I think, are Michigan, Michigan State, Oregon, Ohio State, and the fact that they're using different criteria to rank each of those 2 sets of teams. But I've got Michigan State at number 5. They beat Maryland 40-21. They've got a big game this week on the road at number 4, Ohio State. And this is basically an elimination game. It's an elimination game for the Big Ten East. It's an elimination game for the Big Ten title. And most likely an elimination game for the playoffs. Now, either of these teams, whichever one of these teams loses, I still think is pretty likely to wind up in a New Year's Six bowl. But at this point in the season, when you're sitting there with 1 loss with the playoffs on your mind, you're not exactly thinking about a New Year's Six bowl. Both of these teams still want to make the playoffs. That's going to be a great game this weekend in Columbus. Getting into the top 5 now, and of course 5 and 4. I've got Ohio State at 5, Oregon at 4, for reasons I've already explained. I, too, think that if Ohio State and Oregon played tomorrow, Ohio State would probably beat them. The problem is, like I said, they're not playing tomorrow. They already played, and Oregon beat them. It is what it is. Now, the good news is for Ohio State and Oregon, it almost doesn't even matter at this point that they played in week 2. If these 2 teams went out and they're sitting there at the end of the year at 12-1 with a conference title, the Big Ten and the Pac-12, they're getting in the playoff. It's that simple. If either one of these teams lose a game, they're not getting in. Doesn't matter whether it's a regular season game or a conference title game. It's black and dry, white. It's black and white. It's cut and dry, however you want to say it. If Ohio State and Oregon win their remaining games, they are going to the playoffs, period. If either of them lose a game, they're not. It's really that simple with these 2 teams, Ohio State and Oregon. Ohio State this past week beat Purdue 59-31. This week, they host, like I talked about a minute ago, Michigan State, and probably the biggest game of the week. And then Oregon this past week, they won again against Washington State at home, 38-24, so a 2-score win. Maybe you don't consider that a blowout, but the game was never really in doubt. Oregon controlled the game and won by 2 scores. Now, this is a tricky game. Oregon and Ohio State both have tricky games this week. Now, Ohio State plays at home against Michigan State, whereas Oregon has to travel a long way and play a pretty good Utah team. And believe it or not, Utah's actually favored. Utah's a 3-point favorite as of yesterday. I haven't looked today, but last night on the Lunch Money Show when we looked it up, Utah's a 3-point home favorite this weekend against Oregon. So if you're a chaos person, for some reason you just don't like Oregon, their best chance to lose is this weekend on the road at Utah, and then maybe eventually maybe in a Pac-12 title game, depending on the matchup they end up getting. Could be Utah again, could be Arizona State. We'll see. But 2 tough games this week for the 4 and 5 team for Oregon and Ohio State. Both need to win, keep their playoff hopes alive. Number 3, I've got Alabama. Again, who do I think would win between Alabama and Cincinnati? Well, to be honest with you, I think it would probably be a pretty competitive game. But I do think Alabama would beat Cincinnati. But that's not the point. Alabama's got a loss. Cincinnati does not. And Cincinnati's got a better win than anything that Alabama has. Alabama's best win is maybe Ole Miss, I guess. And they're ranked somewhere between 10 and 15, probably. And, I don't know what you guys think about Ole Miss, but, it is what it is. Notre Dame's in the top 10 in every poll. Winning at Notre Dame is better than winning at Notre Dame by 2 scores. That's what Cincinnati did. In my mind, winning at Notre Dame by 2 scores is better than beating Ole Miss at home by 3 scores, which is what Alabama did. So I've got Alabama at 3, Cincinnati at 2. Now for Alabama, again, there's no sense in bitching and moaning about where I've got Alabama or where anyone else has them. If Alabama beats Arkansas this week, Auburn next week, and then Georgia in the SEC title game, they're in the playoffs. If they lose any of those 3 games, they're not. It's literally that simple. So getting all in a tizzy about where Alabama is or isn't compared to Cincinnati or any other team doesn't make any sense. If Alabama runs the table, they're getting in. If they don't, they're not. It's literally that simple. I've got Cincinnati at 2. They won again this past weekend. A pretty good win for what Cincinnati can get in their own conference, right? Now, obviously, Cincinnati can go outside of the conference and schedule better teams, and they tried to do that. Indiana was good last year. It just so happened they fell on their face this year. You can't blame that on Cincinnati, but Cincinnati did beat them. Notre Dame, a good team. Cincinnati beat them. SMU, for the conference that Cincinnati is in, is one of the best wins they can get. I'm sorry, they play SMU this week. They played South Florida this last week and won 45-28. South Florida is horrible. But 45-28, they did what they needed to do. This game was close though through halftime again. So Cincinnati not really dominating and blowing people out like they were in the first half of this season. I'm not real sure what's happened with Cincinnati. Go back and check the scores of the Cincinnati games. Check their first 5 games versus their last 5 games. I'm not sure what's happened. They're not blowing people out like they were, but they got an opportunity this week against SMU, which would be an okay win. And then they're probably going to play SMU again or maybe Houston in a conference championship game in a couple of weeks. Is that going to be enough to get them into the playoffs? Well, obviously it depends on what else happens around them. We'll talk more about that in a second. And, of course, I've got Georgia at number 1 like everybody else does. They blew Tennessee out on the road in Knoxville this week, 41-17. It was a close game in the first quarter, but then Georgia held Tennessee scoreless for the entire second and third quarter. Tennessee did score late in the fourth quarter to make the game a little bit more respectable. Georgia was a 20-point favorite, between 18 and 20, depending on where you looked. Ended up winning by 24 against the Vols, and this week they host Charleston Southern, a game that's not even worth watching, mentioning, or talking about. So there you go. That's my top 10 as of this week. Again, that's not a prediction of what will be in the future. If you want to know who I think the Final Four will be in the final playoff rankings that come out the Sunday after conference championship Saturday, I'll tell you. I think it's going to be Georgia 1. I think it's going to be Oregon 2. I think it's going to be Ohio State 3. And I think it's going to be Cincinnati 4. Now, I think the most likely of those teams to take a loss between now and then is Oregon. If Oregon loses this weekend, I think they're out, and that would make room for a one-loss Big 12 champ, whether that be Oklahoma or Oklahoma State. So that's how I think it'll shake out as of right now. Right now, my prediction, Georgia, Oregon, Ohio State, Cincinnati. If any of those teams plays themselves out of the playoff between now and then, I think that opens up the door for a potential one-loss Big 12 champ. My prediction on that right now would be in Oklahoma State. Anyway, there you go. This week's top 10. I'll see you guys tonight at 7 o'clock for the playoff reveal show on ESPN. We're going to start the live stream at 7. We'll react to the rankings in real time as they're released on ESPN. Then we'll open up the phone lines and take phone calls for an hour or so. All right. Have a good morning.